So to introduce Jordan's talk, we're just going to take a reading from Lamentations chapter 1. How doth the city sit solitary, that was full of people? How is she become as a widow, she that was great among the nations, and princess among the provinces? How is she become tributary? She weepeth sore in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers she hath none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her, they are become her enemies. Judah is gone into captivity because of affliction, and because of great servitude. She dwelleth among the heathen, she findeth no rest. All her persecutors overtook her between the straits. The ways of Zion do mourn, because none come to the solemn feasts. All her gates are desolate. Her priests sigh. Her virgins are afflicted, and she is in bitterness. Her adversaries are the chief. Her enemies prosper, for the Lord hath afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children are gone into captivity before the enemy. And from the daughter of Zion all her beauty is departed. Her princes are become like harts that find no pasture, and they are gone without strength before the pursuer. Jerusalem remembered in the days of her affliction and her miseries all her pleasant things that she had in the days of old, when her people fell into the hand of the enemy, and none did help her. The adversary saw her, and did mock at her Sabbaths. Jerusalem hath grievously sinned, therefore she is removed. All that honoured her despise her, because they have seen her nakedness. Yea, she sigheth and turneth backward. Her filthiness is in her skirts, she remembereth not her last end. Therefore she came down wonderfully. She had no comforter. O Lord, behold my affliction, for the enemy hath magnified himself. The adversary hath spread out his hand upon all her pleasant things, for she hath seen that the heathen entered into her sanctuary, whom thou didst command, that they should not enter into thy congregation. All her people sigh, they seek bread, they have given their pleasant things for meat to relieve the soul. See, O Lord, and consider, for I am become vile. Is it nothing to you, all ye that pass by? Behold, and see if there be any sorrow like unto my sorrow, which is done unto me, wherewith the Lord hath afflicted me in the day of his fierce anger. From above hath he sent fire into my bones, and it prevaileth against them. He hath spread a net for my feet, he hath turned me back, he hath made me desolate and faint all the day. The yoke of my transgressions is bound by his hand. They are wreathed and come up upon my neck. He hath made my strength to fall. The Lord hath delivered me into their hands, from whom I am not able to rise up. The Lord hath trodden under foot all my mighty men in the midst of me. He hath called an assembly against me, to crush my young men. The Lord hath trodden the virgin, the daughter of Judah, as in a winepress. For these things I weep, mine eye runneth down with water, because the comforter that should relieve my soul is far from me. My children are desolate, because the enemy prevailed. Zion spreadeth forth her hands, and there is none to comfort her. And the Lord hath commanded concerning Jacob, that his adversaries should be round about him. Jerusalem is as a menstruous woman among them. The Lord is righteous, for I have rebelled against his commandment. Hear, I pray you, all people, and behold my sorrow. My virgins and my young men are gone into captivity. I called for my lovers, but they deceived me. My priests and my elders gave up the spirit in the city, while they sought their meat to relieve their souls. Behold, O Lord, for I am in distress, my bowels are troubled, mine heart is turned within me, for I have grievously rebelled. Abroad the sword bereaveth, at home there is as death. They have heard that I sigh, there is none to comfort me. All mine enemies have heard of my trouble. They are glad that thou hast done it. Thou wilt bring the day that thou hast called, and they shall be like unto me. Let all their wickedness come before thee, and do unto them as thou hast done unto me for all my transgressions. For my sighs are many, and my heart is faint. So I'll now hand over to Jord to speak to us on locating Lamentations.
Lovely, thank you. Right, good morning everyone.
Good morning.
Morning everyone. Good, bit more energy. I hope you've had a good sleep and you're ready for our sessions today on Lamentations. Now, I've called this opening session, have we got the screen on, is that all right? Sorry. Locating Lamentations. I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, when I went on youth weekends, Sunday schools and different things, and we got into a story, I have to be honest with you, I at times didn't have a clue where we were. We might be reading the book of Isaiah, and I was like, what is this talking about? Because I didn't realise it was in the time of Kings. Or we might be reading the book of Esther, which comes before the Psalms and Isaiah and those different books. And actually, Esther should come towards the end of the Old Testament. And I didn't understand that when I was growing up. And as I started to do a bit more Bible study, I found knowing where you are in the Bible revolutionary, because it really opened up for me. And it might seem like a simple thing to you, but I'm not the brightest, I'll be honest. It became revolutionary for me to really understand what is taking place in the book that you're reading, especially when you start looking at books like Lamentations that we discovered a little bit last night, is a book of poetry. And so whenever now I do Bible study with Rach and we're preparing for talks, one of the first things we do is try and understand the context of what's taking place. And I'm not going to do the work for this, actually. You're going to do the work for me on this one. I can promise you at the outset, the sessions today isn't going to be listening to me for 40, 50 minutes, okay? You might be thinking, great. You might be thinking, I just wanted to sit there and be a bit passive. I've been there. But the whole point of the workbook that hopefully everyone's got, if you haven't, you can come and grab one from the front in the next couple of minutes, is for you to do the study. Because one thing I've really learned over sort of the last 10 years of being baptized is finding things out for yourself in the Bible is magical, okay? It's the best way to remember something because you've done the study. You're the one who's growing in your faith. It's not just listening to somebody else. So I'd really encourage you this weekend and going forward to do that. So during the talks, we might have some discussion groups, definitely in session 3 today. We might have some reflection points in the booklets. There's little sort of note sections that you can just jot down anything or scribble over it. That's the whole point of the booklet. It might just be to reflect a little bit or just to chat to the people around you as we did last night. And I'm hoping that this will stop you falling asleep, but also hopefully the sessions might be a bit more engaging instead of just listening to me. So this is your first task that I want you to do. I'm going to give you about 8-10 minutes to do this. I want you in small groups. You can do it on your own if you want to, or maybe on your rows, or you can go and find someone in the room and you just have to find some floor space to do this. I want you to create, don't be daunted by this, I know it's 10:15 on a Saturday morning, but I want you to create a timeline of what's happened in the story of the Bible so far up to Lamentations. Now, if I was sitting there 10 years ago, I'd be like, oh my life. 10:15 on a Saturday and you're making us do this. I've been kind. What I've done is, if you're feeling like you fancy the challenge, I'll give you the first one. Creation's the first one, okay? And then Lamentations is the last one. If you're fancying a challenge and think I could go for this, go for it. If you're not quite sure, I've colour-coded bits for you. Some cue cards here in blue. These are sort of your Genesis bits. On these sheets, on the green ones, this is sort of Genesis to Kings, and I've only got 2 for the pinky bits, which is the sort of the kingdom age before Lamentations. What I found this morning, went to Hobbycraft, and amazingly I found this wrapping paper that's 9 metres long for £1.65. I was blown away with it. So Rach at the back has kindly been slicing them up for me. So what I'd like you to do in your groups is I want you just to draw a timeline and jot down from your memory so far what you know up to the book of Lamentations, okay? Please don't look in your workbooks for this, because the answers are there, and that would be a bit pointless for the next 8 minutes. So try and refrain from looking at the workbook. If you want to come and get any cue cards, come and grab them. Hopefully you've got pens and pencils, and maybe just send one person from your small group to the back of the room over there and get some sheet off Rach to put your timeline on. Everyone happy with that? Everyone know what they've got to do? Okay, we'll reconvene at 25 past. Gathered going round, it seemed like we had a pretty good go at that. And what I've done in your workbooks, if you sort of just turn to the next page after the mind map from last night, for those who weren't here, by the way, that mind map, if you want to quickly fill it in now, just write down what you know about Lamentations at this moment, and then we'll add to it at the end. If there's nothing, just leave it blank. That's absolutely fine. But what I've done, I wanted to get everyone one of these little pamphlets, but they were sort of like £10 each, so I didn't think we had the budget for that. But what I've done, there's probably major copyright issues here, but I've screenshot them all into your workbook, because whenever I'm doing Bible study, I got given it once at a Sunday school prize giving, and it's one of those like invaluable tools that I tend to use, because you can just see, it sort of gives you dates, which are probably, give or take rough, depending on which commentator you read, but you can see you've got creation, Abraham, lots of you did this, it goes down the line of Isaac and Jacob, then we have all the life of Joseph, and that's your sort of Genesis account, which was in the blue, which quite a lot of us put a lot of detail down into. Then we obviously get them going into Egypt because of the famine that was taking place at that time. And obviously when they're in Egypt, we get that time where they're being abused and they're slaves to the Egyptians, but they keep growing. And there's the decree from Pharaoh for all the firstborns to be killed. And from that we get the story of Moses and Aaron and how Moses went to say to Pharaoh, let my people go on behalf of God. And then there was the 10 plagues. Then there was the Exodus from Egypt. And then the Red Sea. And then there was the wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. And then around that time, after that, you get the time of the Judges, where there was no good king. Where there was no king ruling over the people at that time, and God gave the judges when they were in the land. And then you get the time of Ruth around this time as well. And then obviously after the Judges and Ruth, we arrive on the scene of, sorry, I'm going through a very fast rate of knots here, but it's just to give you an image before we get into Lamentations. We know the people of Israel wanted a king, and so they're given King Saul, the one that they desired. And we know King Saul's reign wasn't particularly great. And from that came King David, King Solomon, who we thought about a bit last night in Ecclesiastes. And then we get the divided kingdom of the northern kingdom. Anyone know an interesting fact about the northern kingdom and the kings in the northern kingdom? Go on. All the kings were bad, absolutely. There was no good king in the northern kingdom. And eventually, the Assyrians took the northern kingdom captive, okay? The southern kingdom, there was quite a few good kings. We named our son after one of them, Josiah. There were some good kings in the southern kingdom. But eventually, as we're going to discover today, they were taken into captivity by the Babylonians. And at this point, this is where we arrive at the book of Lamentations. So just try and sort of lodge all that information in your head of this build-up to Lamentations. And we're going to now, if you open your Bibles, read Jeremiah 52, because this is sort of on the cusp of where the book of Lamentations can begin. Okay, now, if you just flick over the pages again in your workbook, you'll notice there's a little page that looks like that says Narrative of Lamentations, Jeremiah 52. All right, and you might be able to see it's a little bit faint, but you should be able to see 8 boxes on your screen. And I don't know about you, but this is quite a long chapter and I would like to read it. It's 34 verses. If I was reading 34 verses and having to listen to it, I wouldn't remember any of it. I'm going to be honest with you. So I thought a helpful way to do it, I tested this on my Sunday school class the other week. And some of you might know Asha Palmer. She's great at art. She'll hate me for showing you this. But she did an amazing storyboard of Jeremiah 52. So this is your challenge. While you're listening to me, okay, on your storyboard, all right, I'm going to pause after some sections, And I want you to either draw what I've just read, or if you're like me and you're terrible at art or creativity, just jot down bullet points of what one thing or a couple of things that have stood out to you from the text. Okay? So hopefully they're in your workbook. Follow along or just listen and try and draw or just jot down some bullet points as to what you have gleaned from this, because this really sets up nicely the book of Lamentations. Okay, like I said, I will pause and I'll give a very brief summary of the verses that I've read. Okay, let's go in at verse 1. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king. And he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that Jehoiakim had done. For because of the anger of the Lord, it came to the point in Jerusalem and Judah that he cast them out from his presence. And Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. Okay, just give you a few seconds just catch up and jot down. So what we read there is Zedekiah. He was the last king of Judah, of that southern kingdom, and he did evil in the sight of God. And it might seem a strange phrase, he rebelled against Babylon, but if you've ever read the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah's message was to actually submit to Babylon, which is what Daniel did and other great men. But unfortunately, Zedekiah didn't do this, and he tried to almost fight and rear up against Babylon. All right? So that's the opening box. I'm going to carry on. Verse 4. And in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came with all his army against Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And they built siege works all around it. So the city was besieged till the 11th year of King Zedekiah. But on the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine was so severe in the city that there was no food for the people in the land to eat. So what we've got here is this picture of, you can imagine Jerusalem, it's pictured with these walls around it, all right? And Babylon has almost pitched its tents of war around the city, around Jerusalem. They've built forts and army bases, and obviously nothing can get out of the city, but also nothing can get into the city. And because of this, there's a terrible famine that's taking place where there's no food for the people, all right? Verse 7. Then a breach, or a gap, I suppose, if we want a more modern term, was made in the city, and all the men of war fled and went out from the city by night by the way of the gate between the two walls, by the king's garden. And the Chaldeans were around the city, and they went in the direction of the Arabah. But the army of the Chaldeans pursued the king and overtook Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho, and all his army was scattered from him. Then they captured the king and brought him up to the king of Babylon at Riblah in the land of Hamath, and he passed sentence on him. So what happens is there's a breach, or the wall is broken basically, and a small group of soldiers from Jerusalem, they escape through the wall and they go on the run basically with the king. But the Chaldeans, who eventually become part of Babylon, they go after Zedekiah and this group and they scatter the army, all right? And we see now in verse 10 what happens to the king. Verse 10. The king of Babylon killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. And he also slaughtered all the officials of Judah at Riblah. He put out the eyes of Zedekiah and bound him in chains. And the king of Babylon took him to Babylon and put him in prison till the day of his death. In the 5th month, on the 10th day of the month, that was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the bodyguard, who served the king of Babylon, entered Jerusalem. So this is really graphic what happens here, isn't it? Zedekiah, the king, who hadn't listened to God, He has to watch with his own eyes his sons be killed before him, all his officials that were in his palace at the time when he was ruling as king. And the last thing he saw before his eyes were poked out was all these people being murdered before him. That was the last image before he went blind. That's a terrible thing that happened to this man, wasn't it? This king. I'm going to read a slightly longer section now from verse 15 to 27. So don't try and jot it all down, but just try and get a flavour as to what's going on, okay? So verse 13. He burned the house of the Lord and the king's house and all the houses of Jerusalem. So this was this captain of the bodyguard, Nebuzaradan. He went into Jerusalem and he burnt everything. He even burnt down every great house. And all the army of the Chaldeans who were with the captain of the guard broke down all the walls around Jerusalem. So they're absolutely ransacking Jerusalem now. And Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away captive some of the poorest of the people, and the rest of the people who were left in the city, and the deserters who had deserted to the king of Babylon, together with the rest of the artisans. So there we see God's house, the temple that Solomon had built, being destroyed. It's been burnt down. The walls have been broken down and all the great houses. Okay, this is the longer section now that I'm going to read. And Nebuzaradan, verse 15, the captain of the guard... Oh, I've just read that bit, sorry. Verse 16. But Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, left some of the poorest of the land to be farmers and ploughmen. And the pillars of bronze that were in the temple of the Lord, and the stands and the bronze sea that were in the house of the Lord, the Chaldeans, they broke in pieces, and they carried all the bronze from Jerusalem to Babylon. They took away the pots and the shovels and the snuffers and the basins and the dishes for the incense and all the vessels of bronze used in the temple service. Also, the small bowls and the fire pans and the basins and the pots and the lampstands and the dishes for incense. A lot of things to draw here, isn't there? And the bowls for the drink offerings. What was of gold, the captain of the guard took away as gold, and what was of silver as silver. As for the two pillars, the one sea, the 12 bronze balls that were under the sea, and the stands which Solomon the king had made for the house of the Lord, the bronze of all these things was beyond weight. They took all this stuff to Babylon. As for the pillars, the height of the one pillar was 18 cubits. Its circumference was 12 cubits. Its thickness was 4 fingers, and it was hollow. And on it was a capital of bronze. The height of the one capital was 5 cubits. A network of pomegranates, all of bronze, were around the capital. And the second pillar had the same with pomegranates. There were 96 pomegranates on the sides. All the pomegranates were 100 upon the network all around. And the captain of the guard took Seraiah the chief priest, and Zephaniah the second priest, and the 3 keepers of the threshold, and from the city he took an officer who had been in command of the men of war, and 7 men of the king's council who were found in the city, and the secretary of the commander, 60 men of the people. And let's just skip down to verse 27 for time. And the king of Babylon struck them down and put them to death at Riblah. So what we see here is people were taken, some were left to look after the land. Precious things from the temple were taken, and lots of the people of Judah were taken captive out of their land. Okay, let's just finish this in verse 28. This is the number of the people whom Nebuchadnezzar carried away captive in the 7th year, 3,023 Judeans. In the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar, he carried away captive from Jerusalem 832 persons. In the 23rd year of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away captive of the Judeans 745 persons, and all the people together were 4,600 people. So each year, more and more people were carried into the captivity in Babylon, and we believe one of those was Daniel, as we referred to quite a bit. Okay, the last little section, your last little box, if that's where you're up to in your drawings. Verse 31. And in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 25th day of the month, Evil-Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year he began to reign, graciously freed Jehoiachin, king of Judah, and brought him out of prison, And he spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat above the seats of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiakim put off his prison garments, and every day of his life he dined regularly at the king's table. And for his allowance, a regular allowance was given him by the king according to his daily needs until the day of his death, as long as he lived. So that's a bit of a strange thing. Jehoiakim was Zedekiah's father, okay? And unlike Zedekiah, Jehoiakim had submitted to Babylon, which is why I believe he was looked after at the end of his life, because he submitted to the rule of Babylon as the prophets had told him to. So hopefully there you've got a bit of narrative for the book of Lamentations. Israel has been destroyed. Jerusalem has been burnt to smithereens. The people have been taken away, and God's temple, unfortunately, has been destroyed. Now, as I said earlier, when we now arrive on your next page in your Bible at the book of Lamentations, the book of Lamentations, as someone pointed out to me last night, isn't really a narrative. It's more like a poem. And the book, I don't think you should read it, if you ever read it in the future, chapter by chapter. You need to read the book of Lamentations as a whole. And that's why this weekend we're not going to sort of do a verse by verse study. We're going to look at the big picture of what Lamentations is all about. Because for the last 30 years in Judah's history, Jeremiah has been prophesying and telling Judah, Babylon is going to come, and Babylon is going to destroy you. I've given you enough chances to repent. You've not taken it. So now you've got to submit to what Babylon are doing. And the people, for all the different things Jeremiah had said, they were not listening to what Jeremiah had said. And in this book of Lamentations, Jeremiah is now moved by God, and he describes what he witnesses in Judah and Jerusalem at this time in a very poetic way. And I want to just pull out now a few pictures from this book to really get across to you how bad this captivity and this invasion of Babylon really was. And I'm going to apologise now, because the pictures that we're going to see from this book are graphic, they're not pleasant, and they might upset us because they're awful, the things that were taking place. And yet what I want you to remember is, over the last few years, when you've been scrolling through your news feeds, or maybe you flick on the news or whatever it is, social media sites, I'm sure you've seen some terrible images over the last few years, things happening in Ukraine, things in the protests going on in Iran at the moment, countries in Africa and countries such as in poverty, being destroyed by these gangs. We've got those images in our minds. We've seen them. And I want you to keep those images in your mind while we're gazing into the pictures that Jeremiah paints for us in this very poetic book. And I'm going to put the pictures and the verses on the screen, but if you want to turn there, they're all in Lamentations. So the chapter and the verse is on there for you. So, the second verse, tears are on her cheeks. And in the book of Lamentations, when it uses the word her, it's sort of personifying Judah, Jerusalem. It's speaking of the city, of the people in general. There is no one to comfort her. So the city at the outset of this book is full of crying. It's full of pain and suffering. And all the nations that Israel had once trusted in, they're not there to comfort her. They're not there to go and help. Look at the next one. All her people sigh. They seek bread. We saw that in Jeremiah 52. The city is famine-ridden. There is no food for the children, for the people who are left. The virgins and the young men are gone into captivity. You guys, if you'd have been there, the young people, the next upcoming generation to lead the city, to take on the jobs and the leadership, they're the best of the crop, aren't they? And Babylon took them. We know that of Daniel and his three friends. Those people who they trained up in the way of Babylon in their universities and things like that. The young people have been taken as prisoners. The elders, the old people who are left, the people who probably they think are a bit worthless, they sit upon the ground. They keep silent. They cast dust upon their heads. The wise, respected men and women of the city have never seen anything like this in Jerusalem. They're mourning, they're weeping for what they're seeing, the famine and all the awful things that are going on. And their respect from the Babylonians has gone. They have no respect. This is awful, this picture. Lift up your hands towards him, for the life of the young children faint for hunger at the top of every street. The young children who haven't been destroyed in the battle are left without food. They're pining for food. They're desiring food, but there isn't any to sustain them. And this is probably the worst of all images that you read in Lamentations. No, not this one, the next one. The tongue of the sucking child cleaves to the roof of its mouth for thirst. Babies who are desiring to be fed with the milk from their mother, their tongue is so dry because they've not had anything that it sticks to the roof of their mouth. Terrible pictures that are going on here in Jerusalem. The young children ask for bread, and no man gives it unto them. And that could have been because there wasn't any, or because the men were just so selfish at that time that they only supported themselves. And what a terrible metaphor this one is. And these verses, guys, these aren't my descriptions. This is straight, those words are straight from the text of Scripture. Their skin cleaves to their bones. It's withered. It's become like a stick. What a metaphor that is. The children, the people are so without food that their bodies are referred to like sticks. And the writer of Lamentations actually says, they that were slain with the sword, like it said in Jeremiah 15, those who were killed in the battle, it was better for them because these people who are left in the city are pining away. They're stricken for want of food. It would have been better just to be killed instantaneously in battle than live for months and months on end, dying of hunger. And this is the worst image, I think. This is such a haunting image. The hands of the pitiful women have sodden their own children. Quite old-fashioned language there, but you'll see what it means. They were meat in the destruction of the daughter of my people. The mothers were so desperate in this crisis that their children, their babies, became their own food. They were so past the suffering that was going on. They had nothing to eat. They were desperate. And these are the sorts of things that Jeremiah was walking round and seeing. This was how bad this suffering and captivity in Babylon was. There was bloodshed everywhere of the just in the midst of Jerusalem. Their inheritance has turned into strangers. Our houses have gone to aliens. They've got no inheritance anymore. They've got nothing to give to their next generation. Those promises that were made to Abraham in their eyes have gone. They have no land. They have no temple. They have no king anymore. They're orphans and fatherless. There was so much death at that time that there was many widows and there was many orphans in this place. And due to the enemy, this is such an ironic thing. They had to buy their own water and buy their own wood. The water and the wood that was theirs, it was in their land, but they now had to buy it off the Babylonians. Remember, they had nothing. What an ironic thing this has turned into. And here's the final description at the end of the book. They ravished the women. The princes were hung up by their hands. The faces of the elders were not honoured. They took the young men to grind, and the children were killed under the wood. The joy of our heart is ceased, and our dance has turned into mourning. And perhaps you're just looking at these descriptions and thinking, unfortunately, I actually recognise these descriptions from the world that I find myself in today. And it shows that even 2,000 years ago, the human race has suffered right from the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve brought sin into the world. I don't know how you're feeling after witnessing those images, but they can stir up within us lots of kind of emotions, can't they? It can really anger us that we see injustice like this in the world and perhaps at the time of Jeremiah. It can create us at times in our lives. I've definitely felt like this, like we want to do something about it. We want to make a course for change. We can even, when we read this from the Bible, become disillusioned with the Bible. And we can start to become disillusioned with God in our minds, asking questions like, why does God allow this to happen? Why doesn't God intervene? Why do terrible things happen to good people, or even to people who are expressing that they follow God? And this concept and this question of why does God allow suffering is a challenge for many people, young and old, baptized and unbaptized. And don't think that if you do ever get baptized that your mindset will change. You still have those fleshly thoughts as to why these things happen. And as I said last night, suffering is unfortunately something that does and always in this life will happen to every single one of us at very differing degrees. And so at the outset, the flavour that we're getting from this book of Lamentations is extremely depressing, isn't it? More depressing than maybe you first thought last night. And I do apologise for that introduction. It's heavy, it's depressing, and it's not probably an easy listen. But ultimately, what we've got to live up to, a lot of you are sort of 15, 16, 17, maybe older. This is the harsh, depressing reality of life, isn't it? And perhaps you're wondering, where on earth are these sessions over the next few hours going to go? And like I said, we're going to be doing a big picture. But before I sort of sit down this morning, I just thought it'd be helpful just to get an idea, after we've sort of built up that flavour, of what each chapter is about. And I'm only going to do a whistle-stop tour here. It's not going to be in-depth. I've put in your books on the next page. This is where I sort of got this from. Some of you might know Brother George Booker. It's his book on Lamentations. I've put down his breakdown, which is what I've sort of stolen. And it's just a helpful breakdown just to get a flavour of where the chapters are going. So chapter 1, as we've read, we had as our reading, there's no one to comfort Jerusalem. They're suffering, they're on their own, okay? But what they do start to realise is God is not like human beings. God is different to that. And they finish in this chapter with a little bit of a prayer. But the overarching theme is Jerusalem is on her own here, and she realises that she's got no one to look to in this moment of suffering. Chapter 2 is where they start to change a little bit, and they start to want to blame somebody for their suffering. They're not ready yet to blame themselves and realise that it was their own sin that brought on this suffering. And what they actually start to do is they start to blame God for what has happened. And they start to see the nations around them, their enemies, laughing at them because of the suffering that they're going through. Chapter 3 is the chapter we're going to spend the most time in, because chapter 3 is the middle of the book, and chapter 3 is the hope, okay? And it's the really sort of glimmer of light in this book that we'll focus on in a lot more detail, and you'll notice it's a lot longer than the other chapters. Chapter 4, it starts to move a little bit and starts to recognise why they've suffered. And it starts to look at the leaders, the prophets, the priests, and how they were corrupt. They weren't leading the people in the correct direction. And then chapter 5 is sort of how they're reflecting on how they've sinned, their crown has fallen in a metaphoric sense, and they actually need to turn to God. He is their only hope. Now, as I said, Lamentations is a very poetic book. It's not really a narrative. It's more of an expression of the author's exasperations and feelings. And even though throughout this weekend I'm going to say Jeremiah, I believe, is the author of Lamentations, and he said this and that, there's a really important scripture to remember when I refer to the author or the various characters that are speaking in Lamentations. Because remember what book we're reading. We're reading the Bible. That's the overarching book that Lamentations is in. And everything from Genesis to Revelation has one author, doesn't it? 2 Timothy 3:16 teaches that. The reason we read Scripture is because it's profitable for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, so that the person of God may be complete and equipped for every good work. That's why we read the Bible. Like I said last night, we don't read it just to be more academic. We read it to put it into practice. And Romans 15 teaches us, whatever things were written before, they were written for our learning, so that through patience and through the comfort that we get from Scripture, we might have hope. And I believe God has designed the book of Lamentations in his word to be written for our hope and comfort. And he did it through the man Jeremiah, who did it in this very poetic way. Now, just before we do finish, what can you tell me about poetry or different types of poems that you know? Just shout it out. What do you know about poetry in general or different types of poems? Stanzas, yeah, so they have verses, absolutely. Thank you. Anything else? Go on. Usually it has a meaning behind it. That's really important, yeah? Any types of poems, do we know? Different types of poetry? I'm glad you said that one, yeah, an acrostic poem. Do you know what that one is? Can you remember?
It's like in the Bible where every verse begins with like a different letter.
Fantastic. So each verse begins with a letter, okay? And from that, the poem sort of forms itself. Brilliant. So some of the things that I sort of thought about, we can have rhyming in poems. We don't tend to have that in Hebrew poetry. We can have patterns, we can have syllables, we can have lines, we can have stanzas. Some different poems I thought about. I love a limerick. They're normally quite funny. If you've never heard of a limerick, go and find it. They're great. Haikus, Japanese poems, normally about seasons and nature. And like, I don't know your name, but he just brought out for us acrostics. And interestingly, I don't know whether this is why you said it, but Lamentations is an acrostic poem or book, which means it's got all the letters of the alphabet in. Now, obviously, in this case, we're reading the Old Testament, which is written in Hebrew. The English alphabet, we've got 26 letters. The Hebrew alphabet, anyone know how many letters we've got in the Hebrew alphabet, out of interest? Go on. 22. Now, if you look on the next page in your workbooks, some of Bright Spark might shout out, well, there's more than 22 letters here, and that's because some of them have got different symbols, variations. But if you go to any sort of Hebrew scholar, they will tell you that there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Okay, and I want to prove to you, because I used to hate it when someone, a speaker would just say, like, that's it. I want to prove to you that Lamentations is an acrostic poem, and you'll see that in your booklet. I'm going to show it you on the screen as well. What I've done is I've put the chart up here, and then painstakingly, in all the free time that I have, I went through Hebrew scripts, and I've circled every time the Hebrew letter is there. So you can see that chapter 1 is a perfect acrostic. So you can see, remember as well in Hebrew, Rach told me to mention this because at first she was like, that doesn't make sense. It's right to left. Okay, so we're going from that way to that way, whereas in the English, it's left to right, isn't it? So you can see the first letter, Aleph, matches the first verse. Bet represents the second verse. Gamel, and then we've got Dalet. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing those correctly, but I'll let you off. And you might be thinking, okay, it happens in the first 4 verses. We won't go through, but I've put it in your booklet for you. You can see it carries on. We have the next lot of letters, and so forth from verse 12. Verse 16, all the letters are going in the order of the Hebrew. And up to verse 22, they're all there. Okay? So what we learn from chapter 1 of Lamentations is that we've got a perfect acrostic poem. Okay? From Aleph to Tav, which is almost like A to Z of Hebrew, a perfect acrostic. How many verses are there in Lamentations chapter 1? 22, okay, which matches the letters of the alphabet. All right, let's just have a look at chapter 2, okay, because you might be thinking that's just a coincidence. Right, chapter 2 is almost perfect. But what's fascinating is when you get to chapter 2, when you get to verse 16, okay, Ayin should come before Pei, right? But you'll notice, and I've put this in your workbook for you, it swaps over. And in verse 16, we get the letter Pei as the opening letter. And in verse 17, we get the letter Ayin. Okay? So it swaps over. Weird, but perhaps just a coincidence. All right? And notice again, how many verses in this chapter? 22. Same as the letter. So it's got all the alphabet letters there, but it's not a perfect acrostic poem. Okay, anyone tell me something interesting So that's just a summary of what we're going through. Anyone tell me anything interesting, what they just notice about looking at chapter 3? 66. Anyone do the maths here of perhaps what the pattern is? Right, have a look at the screen. It doesn't go one letter, one verse. It goes 3 verses of the same letter. So Aleph, 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 Bet, Bet, Bet. Okay? And if you do the maths, 3 verses times 22 letters equals 66. Okay? Now, as I said earlier, chapter 3 is the centre of the book. It's the most important chapter, really, of the whole book. But what's interesting, the same as chapter 2, when you get to this weird letter of Ayin and Pei, Ayin should come first, but it doesn't. There's this crossover again. It still follows the same pattern of 3 verses, but Pei comes before Ayin, okay, at verse 46. All right? So again, just like chapter 2, we've got all the letters of the alphabet, but we've not got a perfect acrostic, okay? And you might just be thinking, okay, bit of a coincidence. Well, let's just look at chapter 4. Chapter 4 is back to 22 verses. And just like chapter 2, when we get to the Ain and the Pei, it swaps over. And to me, when I'm reading the Bible now, I know no word is wasted in Scripture by God. I'm thinking to myself, there's got to be something here that God is trying to teach us. What is it that God is trying to teach us? Because in chapter 1, we get this perfect acrostic. Chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, we get a break in the acrostic at the very same letter. It's not like it's just a random other letter. It's the same letter where the swap is happening. Now, does anyone want to make a prediction, okay, as to what's going to happen in chapter 5? Go on, be brave, someone. Go on.
I think it's going to be like a perfect acrostic.
Interesting. That's exactly what I thought. I thought it's going to go back to chapter 1, isn't it? It's going to be like this pattern of perfect acrostic, not perfect, okay? Some people might be thinking, oh, it's going to swap. It's going to be Ayin and Pei again. Right, this is a picture of my Bible. I went through it. What do you notice? I don't know whether you can read that. Hopefully you can. You're probably struggling to notice what's going on. This is an alphabetical mess, okay? It's an absolute jumble. There's not even every letter of the alphabet from Hebrew in this chapter, okay? The letters are repeated. We've got two Ayins, 3 Ayins actually. There's no pattern. It's unordered. It's unstructured. It's just a complete mess of letters. There's no similarities. There's no patterns to the previous 4 chapters. Apart from, look at the amount of verses. We're led in this full sense of security that there's going to be a good acrostic because there are 22 verses, but there isn't. So we get to the end and there is no pattern. There is no acrostic structure. And if you read the book of Lamentations from chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, and you get to chapter 5 at the end thinking, right, I'm going to know what Lamentations is all about, we're almost left confused. We're almost left with no answer to our suffering, like chapter 5. It's just a big mess, a jumble of thoughts, frustrations and questions that are just not being answered. And this sort of structure of the alphabet, I think, is a beautiful metaphor of how suffering can look. Unordered, unstructured. We don't understand why it's happening. It's not logical. It's not tangible. We can't get this structure and this order quite in the right place. And like the last verse in the book of Lamentations in chapter 5 and verse 22, we might leave reading the book of Lamentations feeling like this. God, you've utterly rejected me. You are angry against me. And you might be sitting there, or after the week you've had, feeling like that was such a heavy, depressing session that was full of grammatical bits and bobs, and I'm not quite sure where we're going with this. I'm not sure I really want to sit through another 4 sessions of this. And if we did leave it there this weekend, then we would be miserable, extremely miserable. We would be a people without hope, and we might as well all go home and carry on watching the World Cup or whatever it is that interests us. But I'm going to promise you all something now. The book of Lamentations is all about hope. And the purpose, I believe, of this book is that it should teach us the purpose of why we suffer and the people that we can have and how we can help people in suffering. So I want you now, as we leave this first session, to hold on to those terrible pictures of suffering that we went through in our mind. I want you to hold on to the context of Jerusalem being taken into captivity by Babylon in your mind. And finally, I want you to try and hold that structure in your mind. That moment in this journey of suffering seems like there is no hope. But as we explore this book further, there is hope, and we are going to find it.